All right, welcome everyone to today's Food Governance Community of Practice gathering. We'll be speaking about some of the challenges and opportunities of multi-stakeholder food governance. And we've got a really exciting lineup of speakers and panelists today. Yes, and of course, as with all of our stakeholder engagement processes of our own, because we do see the community of practice as a type of multi-stakeholder food governance initiative, we welcome your participation. And there'll be quite a long slice of time towards the end of our gathering today, during which you will be able to make comments and raise questions. And that is very welcome. In fact, that is one of the intentions of this approach. And we'd like to invite you to also introduce yourselves using the text chat function so that participants in the virtual room know who's here and where we're coming from. My name is Flo, and I'm one of the conveners and facilitator of today's gathering. I'm with the Center of Excellence in Food Security. And I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Camilla Adele, as one of the co-hosts of the meeting. And I'll be introducing the speakers and panelists as we go along. So I'm just going to move forward a little bit with the presentation while we wait for additional people to join us with a few suggestions for this Zoom meeting in terms of protocol and how we can manage conversations skillfully and sensitively. Firstly, except for panelists and speakers, generally it's a good idea for everyone to have switched off their video after introductions and generally. And unless you need to speak, please keep your mic muted. We've often had strange feedback loops happening and yeah, the sound of hadi-das and roosters and children in the background can sometimes make it difficult to hear the speaker. When you do speak, just keep it brief and to the point and mute your mic again after speaking. And if you notice that there is feedback, please use headphones. That helps to reduce that. There is a participants window that you can raise your hand in if you want to speak. You can find that in the emoji button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen. And then sometimes our conversations here explore topics which are controversial and where there are very different perspectives and opinions. And so we do invite difference, we do invite contestation, but please maintain a polite and respectful tone, even with differences. And then also just be aware that the meeting is being recorded for the purposes of research and transparency, and that we will be streaming it on the COE Facebook page. And I'll start streaming once we actually get to the content. So just a few words about this community of practice. We're really just a group of people who come together to discuss issues that we have in common relating to the food system, to food, in order to build networks, to exchange information, but also to produce new knowledge together that can inform better food governance and that can help us to develop collective actions. Our members include academics, farmers, traders, basically all kinds of people who are involved in food governance in one way or another. And this is an open platform. So anyone who's keen to join is welcome. And those people who have joined us regularly form a kind of a core of the gathering and come together as members of our community of practice. And that's quite an informal and loose arrangement. We've had a number of previous meetings. Here's just a list of a few things that we've done in the last 2 years, noting that our activity has increased quite a lot as a result of lockdown, and much of our gatherings, which have previously been face-to-face, have now migrated into the online space. Much of what we discuss relates to food systems, and this poster, this infographic, reflect some of the reasoning, the rationality behind the processes that we're engaging in, namely that there is a recognition that food systems need to change and transition. And so there's a number of reasons why this needs to happen. And the key numbers on the bottom left-hand side of the screen reflect some of the reasons why we feel that this is necessary. And we also identify a number of areas of the food system that need to change. And on the bottom right-hand side, you see this note about inclusive governance. And that is really a big part of what today's meeting is about. Multi-stakeholder processes are seen as a key mechanism to enable more inclusive processes to shape how the food system operates and who benefits and who's included and who's excluded. So this conversation around multi-stakeholder food governance really is framed very much in the literature in the notion of complexity and of so-called wicked problems. The idea being that there are certain societal problems which are complex in multiple different ways, which make it really difficult to find conclusive resolutions of these problems. And much of the literature around these wicked problems and how they should be governed call for adaptive approaches, which emphasize much more participation. And so multi-stakeholder processes are proposed as a mechanism to promote this notion of food democracy. However, as we've seen with many of the responses to the United Nations Food System Summit, there is a risk of co-optation of such multi-stakeholder processes by powerful interests. And there are also questions concerning the legitimacy of multi-stakeholder processes and how they can be used to fabricate a sense of consensus when in fact that may be obscuring important differences. There's also a risk of using the notion of multi-stakeholder processes as a kind of technocratic way of obscuring the ultimately political nature of many of these so-called wicked problems by framing it into a kind of technicist discourse and not recognizing the impact of power relations, but also the importance of very different and sometimes opposing ideological positions and political proposals of how to resolve these questions as to who benefits and who gets to call the shots. Finally, multi-stakeholder processes also can be used as a kind of Trojan horse to enable further consolidation of incumbent power and to evade more deeply democratic food systems transitions. So it's not an unproblematic notion, and is one which, particularly in the context of the food governance community of practice, we feel deserves deeper inquiry. And as such, we've convened a really interesting group of speakers and panelists. Here you see our provisional agenda for today. So initially we'll be hearing some presentations, and then we'll be enjoying a panel discussion. These panel discussions then will open the floor for more general discussion of these issues, where we can raise questions and comment and bring in our own various different perspectives. I just also wanted to acknowledge that our involvement with multi-stakeholder processes and the food governance community of practice is building on a much longer process of multi-stakeholder engagement, and that my personal involvement in this also was inspired by the work of Ralph Hamann and other colleagues at the Southern Africa Food Lab, and that this present gathering in a way is a direct continuation, I suppose, and something which was sparked more than a decade ago by the work of the Southern Africa Food Lab. And we will be hearing much more about that later on when Ralph presents. So I'd like to invite our first speaker, Gareth Haysom. He's at the UCT African Center for Cities and has worked on the Hungry Cities project, looking at urban food insecurity in many different cities. And areas, but he's also a leading researcher on food governance. His PhD was about this topic. And so he's one of the people with, I'd say, the deepest experience and knowledge in this particular area of conversation. And so, Gareth, please go ahead and begin your presentation.
Thanks, Flo, and thanks everyone, and greetings. I'll just share my screen. Please just tell me if you can't see that. Hopefully, is that visible, Flo? Great.
Yes, it's visible.
Thanks so much. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for this. I'm going to speak to the title of the session, but my focus is going to be primarily at the urban scale, and just really just some reflections on that. Flo, I don't know, I think the question of food governance is a matter of kind of, where you engage in the system and how, I think everyone's very skilled at it, and I think we can all learn from it. So I don't know. So I'm going to offer my views on this, and I welcome any comments and feedback from that. But before we start in the kind of concept of multi-stakeholderism and these sort of multilateral agreements, and in the lead up to the Food System Summit, I went back and reread Boyd Orr's autobiography from 1966, so it's of a particular time, but he was the founding Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO. And it was really interesting just in the lead up to the UNF Food System Summit, just to see the points he was making. And one of the resolutions after the Hot Springs Conference and later Ottawa Conference was that it was decided that the organization would limit its activities to collecting statistics on food production and distribution, promote research, and give technical assistance to food deficit countries. So very little has changed. He'd hoped that there would be this World Food Board, which would enable a far broader kind of level of access to food and not let food be used both as part of the Cold War, but equally as a sort of development kind of tool. But it would be something that would be equitably distributed. And after this conference, his gripe at this was the old men had crept back into power, determined to resist the any economic changes which threatened their financial interests. And so not much has changed with our multi-stakeholder processes around it. And then just the point about Britain's position was that I think what often happens is people retreat into their national enclaves, despite kind of pronouncements of multi-stakeholderism. And I think it's at this national scale that we start to have a few challenges when we try to understand what's happening at the national scale, but ignore other scales and other areas in which there are food challenges and challenges with the food system that Flo mentioned. Very briefly, I'm not going to go into this, but if the slides are distributed, this will be there for everyone to sort of review. But I think when we start to understand how people engage in multi-stakeholder processes, it's also worth tracking a whole set of different food system, and in the case of cities, urban system processes that have aligned over a period of over 100 years, from global events, like, the independence movements, from the shift from Keynesian to kind of sort of neoliberal economics, the millennium, and then sustainable development goals, sort of popular culture around Ulrich and the population bomb, Norman Borlaug, and hybrid seeds, Live Aid, and the kind of ways in which popular understanding of the crisis shifted through that. There's also the global processes around sustainable development and climate issues. Food security definition itself has shifted over a period of time. Just reading the World Bank World Development Reports, you'll see how the world development discourse has shifted every year and how those focuses kind of pivot around different events and then move on to something else, the urban events that have happened, but also how in the food space, this movement has shifted around how discourse around producing more to understanding the far wider system. And now, and of relevance to this presentation and multi-stakeholder question, is how questions of sustainability and agency are now forming part of that with a high-level panel, newest sort of kind of definition of food security. So very briefly in that. But what I would argue is quite often a response to multi-stakeholder kind of governance at a particular scale often emerges out of the alternative food movements. And what I've tracked here is just a set of different parts or components within that, going back sort of in sort of an academic recorded history, but anyone involved in food sovereignty or anything, it goes back way beyond the sort of documented processes. But I've often found in my time sort of from the late 1990s working in this space that even within this space, a lot of these particular ideas and concepts, people don't necessarily always agree with them, or they don't agree with someone who might have a slightly different view, or a biodynamic might sit somewhere against permaculture, and there's often these really quite fraught contestations. And I found myself becoming quite frustrated working in these spaces, because even whilst there was a single project of trying to change the food system moving forward, everyone was sort of white-anting one another, trying to undermine something, and there were these conflicts within these spaces. And this has often run in the background of these processes around change. And this frustrated me, but I didn't really have the tools with which to engage these various different tensions and frustrations that have played out. And sitting in these various groupings now, like this or others, we often see those frustrations coming to the fore, or these differences emerging. And Flo had to almost ask us to engage politely, because these differences can be very closely held in that process. So what does that then mean for multi-stakeholderism and multi-stakeholder processes? One of the most kind of prominent forms of multi-stakeholder processes is something called a food policy council, or a local charter, and these have become very popular, and they often represent a group of people who come together over a particular food system issue, be it sustainability, be it equity, etc. They can be government-led, but often civil society-led, and often hybrids, where there are parts of both sitting in that same process. They might focus on a single issue, or they might focus on a wide array of different issues. And Flo mentioned my study of this, and in the US I found 176 different groups that I studied, and about 12 areas of focuses dominated at the urban scale. This focus on scale is something that is quite important to them. And they're very popular now in many cities across the global north, and are often sort of suggested as options in the south. And I want to ask whether those will be something that we should adopt, or do we operate differently here in the south? And the one thing that they definitely do is they connect actors across the food system across different scales. And so they focus on these issues of food system change, often at a particular scale. But I think for me, one of the components of this is this notion that it is about a process of co-production. We're trying to co-produce a change agenda and a change process. But these events are often embedded and often kind of, they come with risks and limitations. They're highly politicized in nature. They're embedded in various different social relations, cultural assumptions, professional incentive structures, often serve to undermine a sort of very clean and clear process. So there are these tensions that are evident all through this process. The other thing that is always deeply embedded in these processes are question of power. And this isn't just like me now speaking to a group asserting a certain kind of power. It might be bureaucratic power, it might be political power, it might just be in terms of someone trying to access an area of land and use that for growth, and how sort of bureaucracy might demand certain ways of getting that, or how legal processes and legal power is asserted, how a large retailer might assert power through contracts and things like that on a small grower, but how networks play out, the old boys club, how various different other forms of power all play into these spaces and come into these spaces and make it even more challenging to engage. So the question for me is, given South Africa's history, given our mass inequality, given the resource deficits that we have, given the challenges we have in our history of our food system, are these processes possible? And yeah, I think we need to try and find ways to do this. I don't know if they're possible in the guise of those that are evident in the global north, where everyone sits around a table and openly discusses something, and there's a common purpose towards food system change. That might be everything being local, or it might be growing organically and bringing farming, might be reducing meat in the diet of a particular context, whatever those focus areas might be. I don't know if that's possible. So for me, my time in this thing is to rather say, let's rather than try to work towards consensus, which I think offers a sort of false reality and false solutions, we need to try and find ways to embrace difference. We need to really think that, how do we allow people to retain the enclaves where they sit without those boundaries being kind of brought up in front of them? And how do they then start to come into a space. What do we need to do as facilitators in this process? Flo mentioned the food lab, the work that Rolf and Scott, who's on this call, have done. Many others have had these convening groups. Andrew, in your work, how these groups are brought into that, where difference becomes celebrated in that process. And so for me, it's using a food analogy, and forgive me with this pot, is, you can chuck a whole lot of chopped up vegetables and things like that into a pot, put the water in there and hope it happens. It's only when that heat starts to build and things and the flavors and the real kind of essence starts to emerge. And so for me, the question of trying to engage in these multi-stakeholder processes is to embrace this difference, dissonance in the difference, but also surf the complexity of these processes. And that's not easy. But we need to find ways to approach these wicked problems and bring them out. And for me, the suggestion is that difference becomes a device through which common positions can then be discovered, where spaces are created for the realization of new perspectives. And here I do want to challenge some of the positions held in the alternative food movement, where, often difference is censored rather than embraced. So, I mentioned earlier, if you use food security as your reference rather than food sovereignty, you're in the neoliberal space rather than a space that is more aligned to a reform movement. And is that productive? Does it allow us to move the food system forward? And there's benefits and negatives associated with this. I've used this particular tool in how I've done this and how I've engaged in this process, where I've identified within the alternative food movement, there are distinct groupings. These do certainly overlap. So it's not to say that there is a single position and everyone holds this. It's certainly not about binaries, but there is a focus on land and the resource. There's a focus on justice. There's a focus on the greener agenda. And then there's often a spatial focus, a more localized agenda. And by asking people to position where they sit in this and to nominate that and to engage that in a productive open space, to allow them to say, okay, I sit here, I'm not prepared to relinquish this particular position, but I can move a little bit further towards that particular position, is a productive way to kind of embrace that difference as a tool. We did this in a particular project that I worked on, where we worked with cities of Gothenburg, Sheffield, Kisumu, and Cape Town. And after a year of trying to work out a collective project, it became almost impossible. And so we used this tool to bring it out. And instead of focusing on the resource, which some wanted to focus on, instead of focusing on the green agenda, which was particularly strong in the north, we found that the actual area where we all connected was around justice and around food justice and around questions there. And how we define that in our context was different, but we found a way to engage in a particular space and to have a productive conversation about transforming our spaces as a collective. And this was particularly useful in our particular space. And one could plot it on a matrix, and often people sit in this particular space. And after a rather fraught argument between two very well-respected individuals who've been working in the food system, the facilitator, Scott, who's in the room, asked, how do different city researchers reconcile major global challenges? And is agreement necessary? Where there's considerable poverty in the area, is it appropriate to call for local and organic foods? However, where there are resources and a real desire to engage in climatic challenges faced by society, why could this not also be the vehemently held position? Both have relevance and both are essential considerations. The objective, even responsibility, of a nested researcher and food system operator in a particular context is to prioritize according to the urgency and need of a particular city or context. And so that's really been the premise around which I want to offer these particular inputs. And I think for me, this brings it becomes useful around three areas. It identifies the key positions that, that people hold, often are not necessarily outwardly evident and articulated. It allows for recognition of those non-negotiables, those areas where those lagers stay firmly parked and no one's prepared to move. But it also, when you read it as a collection of different responses, all focusing on the same objective of food system transformation, it shows how different actors, despite holding different positions, can actually work towards and find a goal that they can move forward. For me, this is particularly interesting, and here, just credit to Andrew, it's there, around how we actually engage once we decide to move forward as a project. There is, Andrew mentioned, there's this authorizing environment, the policy environment, the environment in which policies, laws, legislation, fiscal resourcing is allowed at the various different scales of government. but there's this activating environment that sits below that can provide pressure. And often when that pressure is not uniform, when the voices are incoherent, when they are sort of divergent, the ability for the authorizing environment to engage in the activating environment is quite difficult. And so there is this real urgency, I believe, to find a way to kind of approach the authorizing environment in a real activating way that holds into account, that drives change, but allows them to find spaces where they can interact and engage in certain areas as well. And so really, just to conclude, for me, there's no doubt that the global sustainability challenges remain an essential terrain around which food systems change has to happen. But when we try to bring these global issues into an urban scale, it's sort of a scale that sits in between somewhere, those are not necessarily the appropriate sort of tools and methods with which to bring. Equally, when we try to ask people to copy very small micro issues and say those are going to solve the urban issue, that doesn't align either. And we need to be able to find ways to tease out these broader issues that sit across the middle of the area. So for me, in food system change research, contradictory views are frequently disregarded, and finding ways to give life to difference and to see power is essential. For me, context is a key informant. Views seen as universal in one perspective might be, require significant reflexivity in another context. So it's just around really trying to find ways to embrace difference, use different tools to do that, and find ways to have these conversations around a sort of agonistic kind of politics where we celebrate that difference rather than try and censor it in that way. So let me leave it at that and just say thank you so much. Thank you, Flo.
Thanks, Gareth. That was very insightful. And I really enjoyed how you utilized that 4 quadrants model that you, I believe, had developed also as part of your PhD work to allow these different positions to be made visible in a kind of facilitation context, and to enable that to hold difference and to allow people who are in different camps, so to speak, to understand each other perhaps better, and to recognize that there are different views and to validate those views rather than to pretend that they're not there. Also enjoyed that you speak to the different scales and how particular positions often speak to problems and solutions that emerge at a particular scale, and it's not always appropriate to try and push solutions from one scale onto a different kind of scale. I think there's much richness in your presentation, and I think it'll definitely warrant another look at the recordings. And I think that your presentation also will be very helpful to many of the practitioners in this space and others who come across your talk later on. So thank you very much for that, Gareth. And I anticipate that questions will be raised and you'll have more opportunities to respond. But now we're going to move on to our colleague Chantal. Chantal Witten is at the University of the Free State, but she also represents Sasquatch, an organization that Chantal will perhaps explain a bit more, as it relates quite directly to her presentation, which we can see she's still adjusting on the fly, which is how this kind of work often happens. So Chantal, please go ahead and share with us a little bit about yourself, your background, and the presentation which you've prepared, which relates to a very particular context around infant feeding and how multi-stakeholder approaches can be used to perhaps circumvent regulations in creative but also nefarious ways. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Flo, and thank you again to the community of practice for this invitation. I'm locating my talk specifically on the work that I've been doing around breastfeeding and the regulations in South Africa, which is known as Regulations R991. And as you've explained, I am based at the University of the Free State, not in my technical capacity in nutrition, but rather in the Faculty of Health Sciences for health education. But I'm presenting as the nutrition lead for Sasquatch, which is the South African Civil Society for Women's, Adolescents and Children's Health. And Sasquatch came about in early 2012 a coalition of organizations that are specifically focused on health rights of women and children. And it was actually initiated by the need for government to have one entry point when discussing issues of health for women and children amongst an array of organizations. And so that's how Sasquatch came about. We are focused particularly on the areas of women and children, but nutrition is cross-cutting. And so as time has evolved, we've seen the need to have a nutrition working group. I'm the chair of the nutrition working group, and we have about 6 or 7 organizations that work within this space. And so for the last 6 or 7 years, we've been particularly working on breastfeeding. And I'm going to draw on my work both. I want to disclose, I used to work for the South African Sugar Association, so for industry. And I also used to work for UNICEF in South Africa and a number of other international organizations. So I'll be drawing from that experience as well. So let's look at, I hope I can change my slides here. Flo, I'm not able to change slides. I don't know if it's just on my side.
Yeah, it should be on your slide. Have you tried your keyboard? Your right and left buttons?
I'm working on my keyboard. Page down doesn't work. Entry doesn't work. Let me just escape again and share. I'm just gonna, it says new share. I don't know what that means. 1%. Am I the only person sharing right now, Flo? I'm gonna try and stop sharing so that I can.
You should be the only one to be able to share right now.
My screen sharing, I'm gonna try again. Apologies for that. Okay, should be showing. Okay, so thank you.
Great.
So I'm locating this particular presentation in the space of child food and nutrition. And this is also because in 2020, the University of Cape Town's Child Gauge focused specifically on child food and nutrition. And so I picked up that Gareth spoke about differences. But I think one of the things that we should also focus on is common enemies or common agendas. And so for us, children are central in terms of both social health, of course, and then social development. And the investment in children is long-term, and it is one of the highest return on investments if we put children first. And so this, I'm just showing here in terms of protecting child food and nutrition is the business of everybody. And so if we're working in the field of food and nutrition, if the common agenda is children, then this is why we need to be focusing on a child-centered food system. And that child-centered food system means that, one, it is intersectoral by nature. It means that, one, the end users, which are often the caregivers of children, need to be protected, and they don't always have the voice. They don't always have the power to be able to influence the big players. And the big players are not only the food industry, but it also includes healthcare services. It includes schools and the ECD programs. In the COVID context, it included the humanitarian relief or the lack thereof. It includes the food system, both in terms of the food production, the food distribution, and the food access points. So where women are able to access food. So if we take that as a food system in general, and we put children central to that food system, then we should be acting in the interest of children. And so when we talk about food and nutrition for children, it starts particularly at the onset of feeding. And for us, the onset of feeding is at breastfeeding. And therefore, breastfeeding is the beginning of the food system. Now, why should we be doing this? Because one, we have a double burden of malnutrition in South Africa. Unlike many who view malnutrition as only stunting, we know that obesity is also our biggest challenge. So in the context of South Africa, and by definition of the World Health Organization, South Africa does not have a problem with underweight or undernutrition defined by wasting or underweight. These are not of public health significance. What is of public health significance and is long-standing is stunting, and what is growing significantly is obesity. And these are two outcomes that we know are directly related to poor infant and young child feeding behaviors or practices. And just to remind everybody, in terms of our breastfeeding rates, is that South Africa does have targets set by the UN. We are looking at trying to improve exclusive breastfeeding by 50% by 2025, which is only now 4 years away. We are still a long way off because we know that only 1 in 3 children are exclusively breastfed. We know that we have high rates of breastfeeding initiation, and that's because the majority of our women deliver in facilities. And at those facilities, South Africa has a mother-baby friendly hospital program, and that supports breastfeeding. But once women leave the health facilities, they are then challenged by community and other structural barriers to breastfeeding. Also, for the first time in the history of tracking breastfeeding, South Africa's highest rates of not breastfeeding at all stands at 25%. And this should be worrisome because one, we are no longer in the period of no HIV treatment. So we now have HIV treatment since 2011. And yet we are at the highest level of children not being breastfed. That's 1 in 4 children are not breastfed. The other worrisome area for infant and young child feeding is around complementary feeding. And that means children in the age group 6 to 23 months, only a quarter or less than a quarter of children are eating a minimal adequate diet. That means low in nutrient quality, high in non-nutritive elements such as too much fat, too much sugar, too much salt. And that comes directly back to what mothers have access to and what mothers are feeding their children. So already in 1981, and this was basically fed by global data from the early 70s that showed that one, children were being targeted by the breast milk substitutes, by infant formula companies in displacing breastfeeding. And there was a number of reasons for this, not only mothers entering the workplace, but also in terms of sales, actually displacing breastfeeding to then increase sales. And so the World Health Assembly instituted a code, which is called the International Code for the Marketing of Breast Milk Substitutes in 1981. And it was a set of recommendations to UN signatory countries to regulate the marketing of breast milk substitutes. And later on, it included feeding bottles and feeding teats. Now, the interesting thing is that already in 1982, South Africa had voluntary guidelines that were put forward together with industry so that industry would be self-regulated, that industry would be self-compliant, and that industry would be a team player. And the IPFAN, which is the international body for foods for children, started to monitor the activities of the infant formula companies. And they would present these reports back to the UN. And in all that time, these infant formula companies were violating the very code that they had signed up to, the very code that they had agreed to honor. They were violating their own recommendations. And so governments were urged to then adopt the code with subsequent or the subsequent resolutions that came from the original code through national legislation, and for countries to make it their own legal parameters. And so South Africa had these voluntary voluntary code of conduct for industry up until December 2012, and South Africa regulated the code and additional clauses. Those were included in our own regulations, which are the regulations relating to foodstuffs for infants and young children. Together with government, supported by UNICEF and WHO, these regulations were then almost workshopped and interrogated by a multi-stakeholder group, including health, social development, as well as industry, so that these regulations could be understood. These regulations could be a binding code for a multi-stakeholder approach to improving the breastfeeding environment for South Africa. And so you will find these industry guidelines, which were developed with industry's input, because industry is not one body. Industry is made up of a number of companies, a number of role players, and these industries were also not only self-regulating, but peer-regulating. So often many of the violations would be reported by competing companies. The custodian of the regulations is the National Department of Health, but the regulations fall under the Health Act, which means everybody in South Africa is held accountable to these regulations. So it's not just for health, it's not just for the industry, it is for anybody working in the space of infant and young child feeding, anybody that's working in the food space for children and for trying to improve child health in South Africa. So you'll find these regulations that were gazetted on the 6th of December. There are 10 sub-clause elements that are related to foodstuffs and how foodstuffs can be marketed and how those foodstuffs may be accessed as well. And I just want to go through a few of the areas, because I think this is really important if South Africa, one, has the interest of children and child health, and two, whether we could find some opportunities of inter-stakeholder engagement. This is beyond health. This is about food production. It's about food distribution and as well as food access, so that we can have better nutrition outcomes for children, which, as you know, is monitored by the UN. And so every country that is committed to children would be committed to child nutrition. So what does this mean for the regulations? Most people think it's only about infant formula, but I've circled the complementary foods, because the complementary foods is any food that follows on from the breastfeeding period. So any food that a child may consume from the age of 6 months up until the age of 36 months as defined by the regulations. And if we can invest in better infant and young child feeding, we would have better child health and adult health outcomes. So this is not just about breastfeeding. This is about improving child nutrition and ultimately adult nutrition in the context of health and development. So I wanted to raise the issues about intersectoral collaboration and intersectoral planning around food and nutrition. The regulations talks a lot about the marketing. So the marketing talks about how we position foods. And for women will aspire to feed their children the best. Even if they don't have the money, they will still find it aspirational. And so in the most recent research, products that talk to moms talk on the following basis: humanizing the graphics or showing anything that talks to child development makes moms think that this is the best for their children. Any health claims that are placed on packaging also almost influences how a mom may choose a product. the fact that products are developed by scientists or are put on the shelves by the experts, these are all marketing strategies that undermine mothers' choices, because we know that these are the elements that moms are that moms look out for. So the regulation speaks specifically about the labeling, because the labeling should not undermine a mother's choice. And if we know what spur mothers on to buy foods, then the labeling is already a bias as far as the product is concerned. The composition, not everybody understands the composition. So front of pack labeling has to be simple. It has to talk to the ideals that we want. We want foods to be high in quality, low in the non-nutritive elements such as salt, sugar, and fats. And so designating or designing labels that parents and caregivers can understand helps mothers to make better choices. But if we are confusing women and we are using words that don't have value but add to their decision making, that is unfair. So these are the kind of things that the regulations also try to minimize for moms. Incentivizing, especially when there are free gifts or incentives that go with these foods, also is another area that we've seen often been used where moms are being coerced because there is a free gift. And therefore the regulations have also stopped that. Why we need to pay attention to R991 is because R991 specifically talks to the elements that industry uses to undermine healthy food choices, healthy food behavior. And if our end users are not aware of this, then it is almost unfair, unethical for us to be allowing this, especially when moms are making poor choices with very limited resources, as was shown earlier. The complementary foods stretch along a number of foods. So it's all foods that may displace breastfeeding, but it gives us an opportunity where we can help moms and households to make better food choices. So by limiting the influence of marketing, particularly from food industry, not only is going to help breastfeeding, but it's also going to help us to improve the food choices, the dietary practices for all foods that follow on from the breastfeeding age. And so these are the kind of things, it's not just about formula, as I said, these are the kind of things that we would want to take out of the equation when women make choices for their foods, for their children's foods. So these words like first foods, the baby feeding experts, the health claims, the fact that we use words like NutriPack that have no value, but they make them sound like intelligent, scientifically formulated food choices, are all the kinds of tricks and gimmicks that marketing of foods undermine choices that moms made. So if you had to give a range of foods from a fresh product to a packaged product, most moms see packaged products as better food choices. And this is where we need to actually step in to help moms to make better choices. Multi-sector also includes other players like the academic institutions. We know that particularly in infant and young child feeding, the endorsement by association, endorsement by professional organizations like health professionals, endorsement by other associated product players. So it's not only about the foods, but if the foods are associated with intelligent, with early childhood development, with cognitive development, these all undermine mothers' free choice to make better choices. And so the regulations also put in place to try and limit the influence of the infant formula companies and the companies that make foods for children, not to undermine women, not to use these endorsements by association to actually get women to buy these foods that are not always optimal choices for their children. And so this comes to how do we work with our multi-stakeholder groups, including our civil society, is that if we can build the literacy around food and nutrition as provided by R991. As I said, R991 is not just about infant formula. If we can galvanize our efforts as civil society, academia, people interested in child health and development, we have seen here in South Africa in 2021, we have seen that the energy from grassroots level up has been able to actually stop this kind of wolf in sheep's clothing activities of food industry, because we know that caregivers value and they receive information around infant and young child feeding from the companies themselves. And so the tension is about, if we displace the companies playing this role, that means that we have to step up, whether it is government, civil society, or academia, because there is a need. And that is a big challenge for us. So where to from here? Firstly, we need to actively create awareness of all the provisions for R991, because it's beyond infant formula. Infant formula is only a gateway to other unhealthy foods. That we need to support the call for an independent public monitoring system for all foods that are currently under R991. We've had 10 years of cease and desist, which basically means that when there are violations, we collectively with government, civil society, has been to stop the violations and to support with education. But I think what we need to move forward towards is a call for financial sanctions, because one, if we don't stop this unethical marketing of poor nutritional foods to caregivers, we are not going to be able to actually stop the poor nutrition outcomes that we are seeing. And South Africa is at the top of the list for childhood obesity. And so therefore, it's an ethical question as well for us as food and nutrition advocates and activists. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chantal. So I think that's a really interesting perspective for me also, that you've highlighted that how even in the development of some of these regulations, multi-stakeholder processes are used to come up with regulations that take into account various different positions. And it reminded me also of how our dietary guidelines were developed in South Africa with very strong involvement by industry, which resulted in particular wording being implemented, which, yeah, it's debatable as to how beneficial that was in the long term. And also the importance for multi-stakeholder processes to inform the enforcement of such regulations and to perhaps create greater awareness around their implications and what they mean, particularly as we also can see that these kind of voluntary self-regulation processes are limited, even though they, you mentioned how there is internal policing between different companies, but that also can be undermined and limited. So one of the questions that came up for me, though, and perhaps this will come forward in our debate a little bit further down the line, is in what ways multi-stakeholder forums at lower levels of scale, let's say at provincial or at city levels, could influence the implementation or the monitoring of these kinds of regulations, which seem to be more national level regulations. And I think that's a question that I often have is, how does one allow these things to cascade down to the local level? And then how does one leverage the involvement of multiple different groupings of concerned citizens and other institutions as well? So those are some questions perhaps to look towards later on in the conversation. But I'd like to now move forward to introduce my colleague, Professor Ralph Hamann. As I've mentioned before, the work that he and Dr. Scott Drimmie have conducted at the SA Food Lab has been a great inspiration to me in my involvement in multi-stakeholder processes around food governance in particular. And Ralph works in many ways with businesses, with the private sector. And so I think he has some very unique perspectives on multi-stakeholder processes from that perspective. but also he is in the processes of finalizing a paper reflecting on close on 12 years of multi-stakeholder processes around food governance. And I believe he's going to be sharing some of those insights with us in his conversation and his presentation now. Ralph, please go ahead.
Great, thanks very much. And thank you so much for the event, Flo and colleagues. I think it's really very valuable and great to have this opportunity. And thank you for the invitation. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll try to go fairly quickly to address I think a question at the core of today's conversation, which is, can dialogue among stakeholders work in inverted commas? So in an intuitive sense, that can it be beneficial? Can it circumvent the kind of co-optation or power games of partisan action by powerful actors, especially private sector actors that are out for their own self-interest? That's the question I just want to put on the table here, and I'm going to kind of preempt the conclusion by giving the one sentence answer to that question that I'm going to come to, which is the answer is yes, but only what we call a deep version of dialogue that is actually very difficult to pull off. So this is in a nutshell what I'll try to bring across in the next 10 minutes or so. I mean, thanks, Flo. You mentioned this is based on a paper that Scott, Warren, and Rebecca and I have been working on for a while, just having a conversation around the 12 years in which the Food Lab has been active. You know, so it is an academic paper. I'm going to try to keep it non-academic as far as possible for today's brief input. Those of you that are interested in the paper, please let me know. I'm happy to share it. We hope to submit it within a week or so. So let me kick off. I mean, again, I'm going to be fairly pragmatic in terms of the kind of pitch in this, but I think you know, Flo and Gareth have given us a really good introduction already to some of the key issues. I'm not going to dwell on them. We have quite a lot of calls for dialogue and mutual understanding to address complex social problems. It's kind of motherhood and apple pie. Who wouldn't want dialogue, right? Who wouldn't want partnerships? So there's, you know, hardly a day goes by when some or others, you know, government or private sector people say we need more collaborative governance and so on. But at the same time, we have these pretty trenchant critiques of this idea of dialogue and quests for consensus and their concern around this basically entrenching existing power structures, right? So Mouf here is an author that has written about agonistic governance. I think that's a word that Gareth used. So we're not going to go into so much the theoretical terminology here, but I think there's an intuitive sense that yes, dialogue sounds nice, but actually it's probably a problem, especially if it's dressed up as a kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing, like Chantal has, I think, described so nicely for us. And so in this context, we basically asked this question: when and how might dialogue lead, if at all, to institutional change and social innovation? And so what we basically did was we looked at about a 10-year period between 2010 and 2020 of this thing called the Southern Africa Food Lab. Some of you will know it. There's a website that you can have a look at if you want to you know, find out more about it. Scott has been the director of this for quite a few years, for which we're very grateful. Some of you may remember Miller McLachlan, who was involved in the early years. But I'm just going to point to the highlighted section there, which is off the introduction page on the website. The Food Lab seeks to facilitate the interaction, communication, and collaboration between different stakeholders, including those with conflicting interests. So I think even in the introduction, there was a recognition that you know, dialogue need not always be about you know, everyone holding hands and singing songs around a fire. There is conflict in this kind of process. The Food Lab has tried to bring to bear creative methods to try to facilitate dialogue between actors that don't often speak to each other, right? So apart from the kind of conventional fairly formal meetings like the picture in the top left-hand corner. This is the meeting that kicked it off about in 2019 at Gibbs in Joburg. We would have these things we call learning journeys, where we put a bunch of people in a bus and we drive around the countryside to visit small farmers, big farmers, distribution centers, and so on. We would try to speak to very different people in the food system. And then we'd also try to facilitate diverse ways of interaction among the different people that are part of the dialogues. And we also try to make sure that we have diverse representation, so to speak, of very different actors in the food system, and trying to address power imbalances in the actual process of communication in these meetings and so on. So the analysis, I'm going to really do I can only do a very quick overview, but what we try to do is we try to say, well, let's look at the processes that were generally between 1 and 3 years long. They often used either something what we call a change lab process, which is inspired by the work of Otto Sharma and Peter Sanger and so on, or another methodology we use is called transformative scenarios process, which is inspired by the work of Adam Kahane in particular, but a bunch of other people as well. And so we looked at 7 processes in particular, and we basically analyzed whether they were what we call institutional outcomes. And so that is an analysis that will take quite a while to explain in detail, and I don't have time for it. So what I'll just say now is that 4 of these 7 we thought did have some generative shifts in institutional contexts and systems, which we focus on cognitive shifts, the way that people think about the food system, practice shifts, which is about kind of routine and recognized patterns of activity. And regulative shifts, of course, is if there's a change in laws, for instance, at the national government, or in also the kind of policies and strategies of corporations or large NGOs, for instance, right? So those are the different kinds of institutional shifts we identified. Now I'm going to go very quickly to describe the findings that basically focus on number 1, the enabling conditions, and number 2, what we call the mode of agency, the way that we thought that the generative processes were able to make these impacts, to have these achievements. So the first enabling condition is what we call problem framing complexity. Some initiatives like this thing called the National Conversation, an early one where we basically said, we need a national conversation on food security. This was in 2010. The problem complexity was framed too high. People were overwhelmed. They felt like, oh my God, how are we ever going to make progress? So they disengaged. There was another issue, another initiative called BOP distribution around 2010, 2011. There, the problem complexity was too low. People said, you know what, this is for us to deal with as companies on a competitive level basis. We don't actually need to collaborate on this. And so complexity was too low, and there was no enabling condition for dialogue. There's a kind of basically this is a little bit like what's that? The 3 bears and the Goldilocks, right? It's like a Goldilocks thing. It can't be too high, it can't be too low. You need the problem complexity to be just right, in between, right? Just the high and the low bounds. And the supporting smallholder farmers initiative, also 2010 to 2012. There, it was complex enough to motivate people to engage in dialogue because they realized we need to work together. But it was also seen as tractable because there was a particular focus and people said, you know what, we can make a difference here. The second enabling condition is what we call process momentum, which is that the one step leads to another. And if there is a kind of a building momentum where people get some small wins through the dialogue, they realize this is worth it, I'm going to put more effort into it. And they basically generate a commitment to the process, even if they're not sure what is going to come out of it, right? And again, the enabling condition, this enabling condition was given in the generative initiative, but not in the dissipating ones. So the enabling conditions are all well and good. I think they're quite intuitive in a way. But we then try to understand, well, beyond the enabling conditions, what is it that allows dialogue to have institutional accomplishments? And we identified 3 dimensions of what we call institutional agency, and specifically what we call a dialogical agency, a particular way of interacting and being in the world, so to speak. That is an emergent property of generative dialogue processes. The first one is what we call actorhood. How do people show up? In the dissipating dialogue processes, people represented a role. So Andrew, who's going to speak in a moment, I remember him talking about this kind of image of when you come into a room for a dialogue, do you leave your coat at the door, or do you keep it on to say, I represent company X, right? I think it's a little bit like that, and maybe Andrew can speak to this, but the social role actorhood is when people represent their organizations or sectors and see those interests as priorities. So for example, this one initiative, there was just one very prominent manager, and he said, you know what, this is a source of competitive advantage. And dialogue was killed by that one statement. The other corporate managers also divested from the initiative once they really kind of got that impression. Whereas in a generative dialogues, people develop what we call whole person actorhood, which is that they bring a whole range of identities which go beyond their kind of professional representation. Yes, they are maybe a corporate manager, but they are also passionate about the environment because they've been environmentalists in their kind of youth, or they've had very formative experiences, right? So they're not only basically a puppet of the corporation, they also have other aspects to their identity. So the second dimension of institutional agency is what we call, these are, apologies for the non-academics in the room, these are the academic terms, but what we call epistemic orientation, which is how is knowledge perceived and exchanged. So in the dissipating dialogues, knowledge was seen as categorical. In other words, I engage in a dialogue in a way that says some forms of knowledge are better than others, and there's almost this kind of contest between different ways of knowing. Whereas in a generative dialogue, there is more of what we call an analogic approach to knowledge, where people recognize the need to access and share knowledge from diverse participants, even if you might not agree with it, right? So I mean, here's a quote from one of the initiatives that was particularly prominent, where, which basically, there was an academic who shared a bunch of perspectives on smallholder farmers. And this government official is saying this opened the eyes of everyone. So, there's this willingness to go beyond what, you recognize as your established boundaries of knowledge. And the third dimension is an interaction dynamic. And I think this will also be intuitive in the kind of more adversarial or more what we call kind of dialectic mode of interaction, which is like thesis versus antithesis, and you have this dialectic interaction. There is an advocacy orientation where, if you are representing a particular organization or a particular sector as a representative from a social role perspective, then you are advocating for those interests. And you basically seek to advance your organizational position in this interaction. Whereas in generative dialogues, we recognize this emergent posture of inquiry. They developed, fostered, and enacted a posture of inclusion and exploration of others' perspectives, even when confronted with advocacy orientation. So we had examples where people brought a very strong advocacy attitude or perspective and way of interacting, but there was within the group a sense of, okay, here's a challenge to what, how we're going about things, but let's try to be creative about it without resorting to a kind of a us and them, basically kind of fighting attitude, right? So those are the kind of three distinctive dimensions where we could distinguish between those that dissipated and those that were generative. And if you put that all together, you have this kind of sense that you have certain enabling conditions and then certain ways of interacting and perceiving, pitching up basically in dialogue that give rise, at least potentially, to cognitive practice and regulatory shifts or institutional outcomes. Whereas if you don't have these enabling conditions, and then on top of that, if you have these different ways of interacting in dialogue, you have a dissipation of dialogue. But what I'm trying to also just highlight here is that that doesn't mean that you cannot have institutional accomplishments through other means, right? So through advocacy, for instance, for legal routes, right? You could take people to court and so on, which is of course a very important alternative way to effect change. We're not pretending that dialogue is the only way to effect change. So in conclusion, we really agree with critics of dialogue. Those versions of dialogue that are focused on consensus seeking in a shallow way, because such approaches are likely to entrench power imbalances. But what we are trying to do is that there is what we call a strong version of dialogue that is not directed towards consensus, and it celebrates diversity and tensions in the way that I think Gareth explained really nicely a bit earlier on. More specifically, it demands, this kind of dialogue demands an encounter or the kind of emergent way of interacting between participants based on what we call whole person actorhood and a logic epistemic orientation and inquiry focused interaction dynamics. And in sum, basically what this does, it offers optimism that indeed dialogue can be effective, right? It can work, so to speak. But at the same time, it's a pretty serious caution to say it's really difficult to pull this off because of these quite demanding conditions and ways of interacting that need to be fostered. Great, so that's it. Thanks so much. Flo, back to you.
Thank you, Ralph. Yeah, that was really insightful, and I'm really grateful that you and your colleagues have taken the time to reflect on a decade of learning in these processes and of really distilling it down to a couple of essential insights as to almost like a cookbook of how to conduct dialogues that are indeed transformative at an institutional level. And also I can vouch for the fact that in some cases, these dialogues can be transformative at the individual level and really show up new ways for us to work together, but also work in our various different fields. So I'm really looking forward to reading your paper. And I hope that we'll be able to share that also with other colleagues interested. And yeah, I'm also quite interested to see whether or not these learnings that you've distilled can be made useful to people in other contexts who are engaging with various forms of dialogue processes. We're seeing the emergence of some really interesting shifts in the way, for example, in which the city of Cape Town is conducting its own activities in food governance, which involve processes, transversal consultation processes within the city, and which do include people external to the city. And perhaps there are learnings in what you have presented here, which will enable those kind of institutional processes to operate more effectively. But what I also appreciate is the importance of the depth of time that it takes for these processes to move and to shift, and even for you to learn from them as academics and researchers. So it's a remarkable outcome, I think, of all of these processes that you've presented here. So those were just my brief reflections, and I'm sure that you might have some thoughts around that. And we'll have opportunity to comment and to question. But to kick off the kind of reflections and commentary, we've invited two panelists, Professor Andrew Boraine and Dr. Laurie Lake. And I'd like to invite Andrew to reflect on what he's heard. Andrew is the CEO of the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership and lead convener of the Western Cape Food Forum, which also is engaging in multi-stakeholder processes around food, and is one of the interesting developments that have emerged as a result of the lockdown and the mobilization of civil society in response to the lockdown. Andrew's also an adjunct professor of the African Center for Cities, and is also associated with the Center for Complex Sustainable Transitions at Stellenbosch University. So Andrew, please go ahead and offer us your reflections, having had considerable personal experience also in the realm of dialogue and deliberation processes.
Thank you, Florian, for having me on this platform, and thanks to our wonderful speakers with their 3 inputs. I thought I'd start off just by quoting Richard Sennett, who's an urban sociologist who wrote a book in 2012 called Together: The Rituals, Pleasures, and Politics of Cooperation. And in this book, he explains the difference between dialogics that Ralph has been talking about and dialectics. And he talks about the skills for complex cooperation. And he talks about dialogics, the skill of listening, a process of exchange where people become more aware, which is the opposite of dialectics, the skill of arguing, which I think is quite nice. And in the work of William Isaacs as well, who's written a lot on the politics of dialogue, dialogue is a collective, reflective, and open-minded search for meaning, new insights, and deeper understanding. This stands in sharp contrast to the frequently used words discussion. And he explains here that the root of the word means to break apart, which I didn't know, and debate, the root of that word means to beat down. So I think we're getting the difference etymologically on which way we should go. And Ralph, I thought seeing you were, I think at the beginning you quoted Chantal Mouffe, who's obviously, wrote her seminal book back in the day with Ernesto Laclau. And I thought that one of their colleagues at the time was Paulo Freire, who said, leaders who do not act dialogically, in other words, deep listening, but insist on imposing their decisions, do not organize people, they manipulate them. They do not liberate, nor are they liberated, they oppress. So I thought quite nice to go back to some of those old texts. So coming more to reflecting on some of the inputs from our 3 speakers, Florian, just a word on multi-stakeholderism, because I thought that Gareth's discussion on the origins of multilateralism and the FAO was very helpful, and I agree with what he was saying there. As I understand it, this particular term, multi-stakeholderism, emerged out of the World Economic Forum Global Redesign Initiative after the 2008 financial crisis. And they produced a report in 2010 called Everybody's Business, Strengthening International Cooperation in a More Interdependent World, where they set out the role of nation states, international private sector, and international CSOs in global governance. So it's clearly a very particular term flowing from and beyond what Gareth was talking about, multilateralism. Now, I don't have much experience at that level in terms of global governance and what works and what doesn't. So I'd like to bring it down to my own experience at a more sort of local, city, regional, perhaps national level, and talk a little bit about, I prefer to talk about partnering and partnerships and what have we learned from practice. And I think as all 3 speakers have implied, the approach around collaboration and partnering and partnerships is derived from a systems thinking approach, where one is trying to deal with complexity, and no one sector or no one agent in society can deal with the complexity of the problem. Gareth, I think you talk about wicked problems, and I like to talk about persistent problems, that, stunting has been with us for 5-6 decades. If you look at the statistics, and we haven't made a difference, a significant difference. What's the problem? It's a persistent or wicked problem. And I think that what systems thinking tells us about partnering and partnerships is firstly, we've got to ask the question, what is the desired change? Why? And for whom? And I think that the high-level panel of experts in the global food system have introduced this concept of agency in the shift towards food security in the food system. And agency, they say, goes beyond access to material resources in that it includes empowerment, the ability of people to take actions that helps improve their own well-being, as well as the ability to engage in society in ways that influence the broader context, including the exercise of voice in shaping policy. So I'm certainly taking that as one of the motivations to go beyond just government policy or government and big business policy, and how do you include ordinary people in shaping policy and changing the way in which the system performs. I think that as part of this approach, one always has to do a contextual analysis, which includes this strategic assessment of the balance of forces or balance of power and power configurations. And I see there's a bit of chat on that on the side. And I thought Gareth listed that one slide on the different types of power, very helpful, breaking it down and almost going through in the food system or food and nutrition system, where does power lie? And who has the power to change that? I think that I would certainly agree with what he's put on the table there. And I think part of this is being quite, before one goes into a dialogue or partnering or partnership process or collaborative process or multi-stakeholder process, to do a stakeholder and actor analysis and to tease out the relationships between the different stakeholders and different actors in the system. And particularly, and Gareth referred to this, to do analysis of the relationships between the top-down authorizing environment and the bottom-up mobilizing environment. And Ralph, I think in your discussion on enabling conditions, what you were hinting at is at what level does dialogue or partnering take place? And how much complexity can dialogue cope with or deal with? And in my experience, one needs dialogue or collaborative processes, both at a grassroots and at smaller scale level, which is where participation and practical action gets mobilized, and at a strategic level, at the level of food system policy and governance, and really look at how these two things work together. Bottom up on its own often can't shift the needle. Top down on its own is often a very blunt instrument, doesn't work very well. So how do we engage at both levels? And that's a skill. And we don't always have those skills to engage at a number of different scales and levels at the same time. That's where I think we all struggle in the system. Then, Florian, I'd like to say categorically that partnering or collaboration is not just a virtue in and of itself, but it's a means towards an end. And what's that end? It's system change, it's collective impact, it's shifting power relations, it's improving mutual accountability, improving system governance, whatever your goals are. And I would say that partnering is not always possible or desirable. And Gareth, I think, has spoken to the risks and limitations of different, it's context specific. You can't just apply it in the same way to every system and every context and every area. So what are the elements, practical elements of a sort of partnering approach, a collaborative approach? Well, I think you can sort of say, well, it's a combination of shared vision, common agenda, and joint action. And Ralph, I certainly agree with you that it cannot ever be a quest for consensus. I don't think that's helpful. And in our experience, we tend to downplay the focus on getting to a shared vision. And often these dialogue processes spend hours or days or months trying to get everyone onto a shared vision, when we know actually there's competing visions in the system, and that's democratic. Why not? And so actually to move swiftly, to move beyond the limits of trying to get everyone onto the same page or to a shared vision and trying to get to that 100% consensus, because you'll never get that. I think in our practice, we try and work out how do we get to a common agenda, which is very different from a shared vision. Because a common agenda says, how do we work affirmatively with difference? And I think, Ralph, everyone was referring to this. And to point out that a system is usually characterized by high levels of mistrust between stakeholders and actors when you start off, including about the process of dialogue and partnering itself. There's always deep suspicion from all sides, not just from civil society. Government, politicians, and government officials often start off with a deep suspicion of the motives and role of civil society. So how do you, what's the starting point to overcome that? And for a common agenda to work, I think it's really saying you can work together on select issues or a small number of select issues despite differences. And I think Chantal's example of investment in children as a common agenda or child-centered food system as a common agenda is a good one. That would be an example of a common agenda, and all the actors that she listed in that diagram on the slide don't have a shared vision for the future. They have competing visions for the future. But if you bring them together on a common agenda, there are ways in which one can work together. And I think Gareth talks about it as embracing dissonance, which I would agree with. So it's very much based on an analysis of competing, common, and overlapping needs, interests, and behaviors in the system. And then I would also say, Florian, that partnering is not an unprincipled or value-free approach. It's not a kind of, random rainbowism or anything like that. So I would say, Chantal, if there's an international code of marketing of breast milk substitutes since 2008, firms that break the code or act in devious ways to get around that code don't make for good partners. They shouldn't be part of a partnership. It's very clear that there has to be lines drawn and limits, within a partnering process. And, all partners don't need to share the same long-term view, even short-term views, but it helps if they share the same values around mutual accountability, two-way accountability, collaborative behaviors versus command and control, hierarchical behaviors, and a commitment to information and knowledge sharing as opposed to hoarding, and privatizing knowledge. So I think those are some of the values that you build a partnering approach on, despite differences. And then, Florian, just to say, in practice, effective partnering, partnering works best when it starts focusing on very specific themes and or areas at different scales. And it does always work if there's a kind of whole of government and whole of society approach. Because often government itself as a partner is at 6s and 7s. And Gareth, you've looked at that in your food governance work. There are contradictory food policies as we speak within national government, provincial government, and local government. And they in themselves are sites of struggles. So I think one of the specific goals of a partnering approach is how do we nudge the top-down authorizing environment dominated by not just government, but by big stakeholder interests to create a more enabling and supportive environment for bottom-up mobilization and better relationships between the top-down authorizing environment and the bottom-up mobilizing environment. And then my final point really is none of this matters if it doesn't lead to some sort of change. People get very frustrated with dialogue if they're not seeing some sort of change process emanating from it. Then it just, in a sense, becomes a little bit of a smokescreen for preserving the status quo. And Ralph, you asked the question, can dialogue work? And I agree with you. If it's a deep dialogue, it can work. And I think you were also saying it's a deep dialogue that leads to action. Because when people are able to not have a superficial consensus, but start working together, moving from that dialogue to action, you build trust quicker and more deeply working together in practice. And sometimes dialogue on its own, if it's just in that room, especially with everyone keeping their jackets from, and I'm from business, and I'm from labor, and I'm from government, and I'm from the community, those sort of dialogues, which we've experienced often in a kind of NEDLAC situation, are really no more than industrial bargaining. And might is right. And whoever is more powerful at a particular stage wins out. It's not a win-win. It's actually a win-lose situation, depending on the context. And I think often when you can get people out of the room or off the Zoom conversation, the dialogue side, and into action in the field, as it were, the easier it is to start breaking down differences and building trust and identifying the genuineness or otherwise of your partners to work together with you. Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks, Andrew. Some really useful and pertinent points, and yeah, really enjoying also your bringing in Paula Freire and some of those old theorists, reminding me to deepen my own readings. And yeah, thank you for sharing the wealth of your experience in this space. Our main speakers will have an opportunity to respond to some of these points that you've raised, but I'd like to invite Laurie Lake from the UCT Children's Institute, our second panelist, to offer her reflections. Laurie is an expert in science communications, and she's also been one of the key people involved with the child gauge. Yeah, Laurie, please go ahead and let us know some of your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you, Flo. My input today is really drawing on my work with the Advocacy Committee in the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health at UCT, and our efforts over several years to eliminate conflicts of interest associated with breast milk substitute industry sponsorship of pediatric conferences. So really what I'm wanting to do is to perhaps sort of shift the conversation sideways slightly and encourage us to maybe reflect a little bit more critically around our own practice. So we often spend a lot of time discussing the tensions between the commercial determinants of health and the ways in which the food industry profits have come at the expense of public health and nutrition, and particularly the nutrition of South Africa's children. But in this case, I'm interested in the conflicts of interest that arise within an individual or an organization. And in particular, the conflicts that arise between the strings that might bind us to our funders versus the primary relationship of trust that we hold as guardians and advocates for child health and nutrition, or for sustainable food systems. And the OECD defines a conflict of interest as a conflict between an individual's public duty and their private interests, and the kind of conflict which could improperly influence their performance of their public duties, their official duties and responsibilities. So, for example, where the sponsorship of academic conferences or the offer of research grants or funding for academic posts and other gifts and financial incentives threaten to undermine our professional integrity, our independent judgment, and may compromise our loyalty to our patients or to the general public that we serve. And that sort of ties into some of the sort of popular sayings, such as there is no such thing as a free lunch, or don't bite the hand that feeds you. And in South Africa, we're all familiar with the threats of corruption and state capture, but we're often quite blind to the ways in which this also applies to academia and civil society. And it's of grave concern when companies like Nestlé deliberately seek out thought leaders in academia and civil society who have high peer credibility, with an explicit intent to retain and reward those who are positively disposed to the company brand. And that was part of Nestlé's stakeholder analysis back in 2012. So in the current context, it's extremely worrying that Professor Lindy Wesibande, who heads up the Arua Centre of Excellence in Sustainable Food Systems at the University of Pretoria, is also currently serving on the board of directors of Nestlé Global. Because that raises questions about which master does she serve, and to what extent has that Centre of Excellence been captured by industry. So why worry about conflicts of interest? Often as academics, we think we are objective, we're immune, and yet a Cochrane review has found that despite academics' best intentions, conflicts of interest lead researchers to favour corporations either consciously or unconsciously. And that doesn't mean that there's necessarily collusion or corruption. Things may well be above board, but it becomes very difficult to distinguish subtle unconscious bias from deliberately concealed impropriety. It's also important to recognise that being conflicted also means potentially being conflicted in the future. So the money that comes in now today may have an influence on the kinds of decisions and choices you are able to make in the future. And we also need to be attuned to the dangers of perceived conflicts, which may be as damaging to our reputation as actual conflicts of interest. So if there's perceived impropriety, if our positions seem to or be perceived to have been compromised in some way, that may tarnish our reputation as scientists, as organizations or corporations. And the International Society for Social Pediatrics has identified several further dangers arising from industry sponsorship, which may create the impression that your department or your association publicly endorses, for example, formula feeding. While support for salaries, equipment, and/or research or teaching programs means that an institution can become indebted to the company in ways that may stifle any expression of doubt about their products or practices, either now, today, or into the future. So it becomes extremely difficult to bite the hand that feeds us. And in government, there have been significant efforts to put in place measures to address conflict of interest. For example, in the Western Cape, government has encouraged employees to always question the impression that an acceptance of a gift could make. And in no circumstance accept a gift where he or she could be compromised. And in fact, all gifts need to be reported and be made, I guess, publicly visible for the purposes of auditing and reporting. So there's a recognition that there's a need for transparency and a need for accountability where gifts of any kind are concerned. Western Cape government again recognizes that a gift, no matter how small, can create a sense of obligation towards the giver. And it can become, over time, a catalyst for more serious acts of misconduct and corruption. And that public perception matters. So even when an offer has been made in good faith and where there is no ulterior motive involved, it is absolutely vital to consider how others might perceive the offer and your acceptance of that offer, especially so when your work is in an area that is of sensitivity or of particular trust, such as the case for infant and young child feeding. So the question then is, what do we do? What are the options to both prevent and mitigate conflicts of interest? How do we make sure that we, in a sense, keep the fox out of the hen house? Or protect the sheep from the wolf in Chantal's analogy. And I guess the first step is education, is to raise awareness through forums such as this, but also through professional education so that we build a really awake citizenry who are aware of the potential risks and harms associated with conflicts of interest. Second is to do as is recommended by the Western Cape government, to ensure that we are transparent, that we declare any conflict of interest. And this is certainly a necessary first step. It brings the issue out into the open and makes it public, but it doesn't make that conflict of interest go away. Another possibility is to ensure that there's adequate screening to identify individuals and institutions who have conflicting interests, and to ask them to recuse themselves from participating or taking on positions of influence. A third is to dilute funding, which is something that's recommended in terms of industry sponsorship of conferences in Regulation 991, where you're allowed to accept some industry funding as part of a broader pool. But again, that doesn't remove the conflict. It doesn't remove that gift-giving relationship. And it doesn't remove a relationship of dependency that gives industry potential leverage over both current and future decision-making. And nor does it remove the potential risk of reputational harm. So if you've received that funding, you must acknowledgement. Again, it suggests that your organization endorses and supports, for example, in this case, formula feeding. So again, diluting funding is not sufficient. Chantal has talked a bit about sanctions, and Regulation 991 provides for sanctions. Yet, to date, it's not been that clear whether these sanctions have been enforced and whether they've had any meaningful impact, given that we're dealing with a multi-billion-dollar multinational industry. What kinds of sanctions could we possibly impose? And also, sanctions are, in a sense, too little too late. The violation has already occurred. The conflict of interest has already played out. The damage has been done. So what happened within the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health at UCT is we actually called on the department to divest and to avoid any future industry sponsorship in an effort to really protect and maintain.
Where do you mute and unmute? Yeah. And where where's your volume button? Where do you turn on the volume? Yeah. You see on WhatsApp, it's at the bottom. So it's on. I can see it's on there. No, say on your keyboard. Where do you turn on?
Would it be possible to quieten down? I just want to finish off the last few words, if possible. Thank you.
Ruby, your phone is on. All right, you've muted yourself. Great.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So really a concern around how do we limit conflict of interest? How do we maintain our independence, our professional integrity? And how do we safeguard the health of our most vulnerable women and children? And to ensure that there is a clear line, a clear distinction between our work as academics and the role of industry. So I just wanted to put that on the table, because I think very often we think of it as an us versus them, but very often these lines are incredibly blurred. And I think we need to be far more attuned to the very tangled web of relationships and influence that are playing out across the food system, the broader food system, and the very real threat of actors in civil society, academia, and government being captured by a very powerful multinational, multi-billion-dollar industry. whose interests are primarily about generating profit and expanding in the global south, and whose marketing of unhealthy food products to children has had a significant impact on both their immediate health and survival and their long-term development.
Thanks, Laurie. Thanks for putting us also in the crosshairs a little bit as academics. I think it's really important for us to maintain a degree of reflexivity. And I think that also goes more specifically for multi-stakeholder processes convened by academics or groups of academics. There's a form of power in that itself, which is often not clearly reflected. And you know, the ways in which we convene dialogues like these rely on access to data, and they obviously privilege certain kinds of stakeholders to being able to participate in these processes in the first place and exclude others. So I think it's really important that you've raised these issues, and also that you've raised your concerns around you know, where prominent academics receive funding from, and how that may place them in conflict of interest situations, and that multi-stakeholder processes can be undermined by these other lines of accountability, which may make it difficult, challenging conversations to even take place. So we've come to the end of the formal part of our set of presentations and reflections. I'd like to offer the presenters an opportunity to respond to some of the points the panelists have raised, but then also to open up the space for other participants in our conversation today to raise questions or make comments in response to the speakers and panelists that have spoken to date. So yeah, if any of the speakers would like to respond to anything that the panelists have said so far, please go ahead, raise your hands, or just speak up. And otherwise, participants who want to speak, please use the emoji reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand so that we can call you to speak. Thanks. Gareth, Ralph, Chantal, any comments? Ralph, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be really quick because I think it'd be great to go to the other participants. But you know, I just want to really, you know, I mean, Andrew's points are very well taken. I really appreciated the kind of references. Senate sounds like a book. The Together book sounds like a book we should look at. Sorry, I haven't had a chance to do that yet. But you know, in particular, I just want to reflect on Laurie's challenge to us as academics, and Flo, you already alluded to this, and in some ways it might be particularly salient for someone like myself working in a business school where, you know, we have, you know, classrooms sit managers that are in companies. Our kind of rationale is to teach and train managers to become you know, more effective in their work, but I think our mission, especially at the GSB, is also to become you know, more socially responsive rather than extractive. But the points made by Laurie about conflicts of interest and the subtleties of, you know, self-censorship, for instance, I think are really important. I mean, just the other day, I was on a panel on an international foundation for management development, kind of collection of business schools and businesses, and one of the panelists was going to be someone from Nestle, and I said to the convener, and I was going to be the chair, and I said to the organization that was doing this, and I said, well, you know, I'm going to need to raise some potentially awkward issues with this panelist. It was actually very funny because the organizer of the conference said, no, don't you dare do that, because this is, you know, we are a foundation with these members, and I mean, they didn't say it in those words, but they were really uncomfortable when I mentioned it. And I said, well, you know, you can't, it would not do justice to this panel if we would just put the kind of thing under the carpet. And it was very interesting to see the unease around it. So I think Laurie's point is really well taken, that you know, organizations that in some ways rely on, funding and so on from corporations, there is a tendency to try to avoid awkwardness of that kind of sort. So I just wanted to say it is an important point. We grapple with it.
Yeah, thanks, Rolf. And this has also brought to my memory some really difficult conversations with my former colleague, late Professor David Sanders from the UWC School of Public Health, where he was vehemently opposed to the inclusion of corporate stakeholders in a multi-stakeholder process that we convened in partnership with the Southern Africa Food Lab, because he felt that these organizations already have very effective channels to influence policy, and that involving them in such conversations might delegitimize the conversation and might allow them to readjust their own strategies to counter the kind of advocacy that's taking place, and that by definition they cannot engage in a dialogical way, but would only engage in a dialectical way. So really tricky. Again, there are different views, and I don't know if there's one correct answer to these things, and how to avoid these kinds of conflicts of interest. I don't think there's a quick and easy answer to that. Chantal, yeah, I see your hand is up.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to pick up on two things that Andrew said that I think is really important. Is when we have something that cannot be, it's undeniably challenged. So making children central to any development can't be challenged, no matter what our views, no matter where our philosophical ideology lies. And that helps when we're trying to bring a multi-sectoral group around a particular topic. And for me, I think that we must be, especially as academics, we must be actively and consciously sensitive to the power dynamics. And even as academics, we do wield some power over communities. And if we've learned a lot now that top-down doesn't work, and that we need to be supporting bottom-up. And who is representing bottom-up, and how we're allowing bottom-up to actually voice their concerns, voice their ideas. This needs active and conscious engagement. I think we as academics, just like corporates, we have a lot of facilities at our disposal. We have the networks already. And so for me, one of the things about the community of practice has really allowed us to think about those that are not in our circles. And the more we do that consciously, I think we will change the dynamics. Especially corporates have used health professionals and have used academia for an endorsement by association. Now we need to use that power to endorse the grassroots level changes that need to take place. So I think we need to also take what corporates were doing. We need to also start using those tactics so we can learn from them as well. Thanks, Flo.
Really interesting proposal there to leverage the strategies of the corporates to perhaps balance the scales a little bit and open space for more dialogue and include people who are usually excluded. Are there any other comments from the speakers or panelists? In which case, I'll open up the conversation now to the broader group of participants here. Again, if you would like to comment or question anything in particular, please use the reactions button at the bottom of your bar to raise your hand. Feel free to speak. All opinions are welcome and valued. And yeah, we hope that these questions will then raise additional perspectives. Helena Wagner, I see your hand is up. Please go ahead.
Just find myself. Hi, Flo. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this very rich conversation. I'm going to keep it short. I think what's coming up for me is I've been involved in this very interesting journey around the professionalization of dialogue. And it's been based on an organization in the States, the Virginia prison system, that managed to make the entire organization dialogic. And they've got very rigorous processes, and they've got very specific processes that they use for very specific goals, from counterband weapons being smuggled in through kitchens to conflicts between prison wardens and prisoners. And I don't want to go into too much detail, but the conversation has really been what I've heard reflected here as well, that dialogue is a very loosely used word. And to really use it successfully, there is a level of professionalism that's needed around it. And there has been a very interesting article by Professor Bill Isaacs on it. I don't know if he's a professor, doctor, whatever, that I would be happy to share. But to conclude, I think that a conversation around dialogue and multi-stakeholders really needs to be very specific around what is dialogue and what are the skill levels and what is needed to really have a conversation that's able to address all these different very real concerns. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Helena. Yes, I think there's obviously technical skills, and there's also the kind of knowledge and experience that comes with a community of practitioners, of people who are working with dialogue. And then there's also deeper meta skills, I suppose, of the kind of listening that Andrew reflected on earlier. I think these all require experience and skill to apply effectively. So thanks for flagging that. Julian, I see your hand is up.
Thank you, Florian, and thank you, colleagues. Well done on a great topic and a great conversation. And yeah, I agree with much of what's been said, but I've got a slight concern about this sort of dichotomy between what was originally referred to as sort of seeking consensus versus celebrating, difference. And Chantell, has put before us, this sort of child-centered concept of food and nutrition security from infancy and pre-infancy. And, my belief is that, I haven't heard sort of design-led thinking methods mentioned this afternoon, but those methods basically say all ideas are welcome. And if we're, and then we seek to implement agreed actions of some kind. And we can agree that a child-focused approach is sorry for the word, a consensus approach. If we're not investing in our children's nutrition and their well-being for the future, and we can't agree that on some form of consensus or a similar word around that, then I think we're splitting hairs. And I have followed the conversation, and I understand that we want to enable difference and enable diversity. But sometimes that also leads to the kind of challenges that we're facing in this multi-stakeholder environment where certain people should be excluded. I mean, Andrew referred to, people who are blatantly, abusing their power as child nutrition providers in terms of the regulations, and perhaps they should be left out of the conversation. So my sense is that, a lot of what this forum appears to be grappling with and has over the last 2 or 3 years has emerged already in the innovation literature, where we need to embrace paradox, we need to embrace complexity, but we also need to employ design-led thinking type methods which encourage creativity. And I remember coming to the province, working for government for the first time 6 years ago, being absolutely astounded. I had to really coax people to just even contribute in a conversation. The boardroom politics, even in a sort of so-called empowerment session, is so powerful that people will not say what they're thinking or feeling. And the sort of powerful agendas, the boardroom agendas that exist are very persuasive, even without a word spoken. So, creating that safe space for dialogue is incredibly important, that safe place for inclusion, a safe place for creativity, because so often the one person's creativity leads to another person's creativity, leads to an idea that is useful for everybody. And each of the major sectors, call it business, government, academia, and civil society, broadly speaking, have different strengths and weaknesses. In academia, by default are often very conservative with their information sharing, because it's the next paper and it's the next idea and it's the data that leads to that. And sometimes that's a handbrake on process. I've just mentioned a governmental sort of handbrake on process, which is this top-down sort of stifling that needs to be loosened up. And so I guess what I'm suggesting is we need to invest in the design of process. And that's kind of what Helena Wagner said. How do we design proper dialogue? How do we design that we share information effectively? How do we invest in the process of change making and transformation? Because we have to foreground this very, very serious problem that we may see another 20 years just like the last 20 years. And it has to be our first priority, that we don't want malnutrition, stunting, and other problems of child nutrition in South Africa and indeed elsewhere in the world to persist. And we need to begin to embrace sort of transformative and innovative academic learning and thinking that has been brought forward and by experts in that discipline, Mazzucato and others, and say, how do we transform our food system, rather than perhaps debate around issues of consensus versus accepting difference. I've got some other comments, but I think I've said enough. Let's design the change we want to see, and bring in the change makers who can enable that change. And let's share the information that we need to share. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. I appreciate your reflections. Thanks also for just even mentioning this concept of design-led thinking. I know that it's one of the points that you've made often in the past, and also the quadruple helix model for innovation. I think those are important, also conceptual tools to bring into this space. And I appreciate also your comment around splitting hairs. I think those are all well taken. I see, Kurt, your hand is up. Kurt, you've just also produced another set of dialogues around food dialogues. So I think your reflections in this space now would be extremely valuable and helpful. Kurt.
Thanks, Florian. I raised my hand before Julian had a chance to make his comments, and I'm not sure, I see Gareth's got his hands up. I'm not sure if he wants to respond to what Julian said or not, because I want to change tack just a bit. Okay, then thanks, Gareth. Then I'll carry on. So yeah, Florian, as you rightly say, we've been running our food dialogues last year, this year. Currently, we have another panel discussion coming up next week on the 14th as well. And of course, the term dialogues is quite fraught. It's been used quite widely, and we see it picked up more and more frequently as well. We picked the name food dialogues back in 2014, and sometimes it's a bit of soul searching. Are we doing the right thing in that way? But I just wanted to share the kind of the perspective that we've taken, which is that the kind of dialogues that we're trying to facilitate, or that we are facilitating, where we hope we're achieving, is not one of consensus seeking or looking for collective action of some kind as an outcome, but really diversifying the voices who are participating in the dialogue. And while there are some power dynamics, was said, some people already have their voices loudly and widely heard. If we exclude certain voices from the dialogue, it also means that they're not at the table and they lack some of the opportunity to hear voices that they might not otherwise have access to or bother to pay attention to. So there's an underlying assumption that if we can get a diversity of voices to the table, that there's actually a benefit from that, even from those who are widely heard. We try not to give anyone a more or less kind of privileged position within the dialogue. So this time around, we interviewed someone who was never finished matric and washes cars in a township, and that person has the exact same position as someone who's quite affluent and well educated and well resourced and in a prominent position. That doesn't mean they're the same person, but anyway, we're conscious of these dynamics to the extent that we can be. So it's to say that we're looking to add complexity to the conversation and believe that there's a benefit from that without seeking to bring everyone together to a common understanding and to seek, a common goal. And that as themes emerge from this complexity and diversity, that we can highlight those. And maybe there are areas of disjunction, areas of commonality, but the dialogue itself isn't seeking to then resolve those. And of course, there are going to be shortcomings. And I think one of the wonderful things about what this session puts together is, it's further critique and critical thinking. And I would hope that those who have a chance to be part of or to see the dialogues as we're running them will continue to provide critiques to help us shape what we're doing and why and how. And the additional thing that I want to mention is that this year we've diversified some of the group of people who are supporting the dialogues, and we brought for the first time a corporate entity on board as a co-host and a supporter, and that is Solve at the Waterfront. So the V&A Waterfront's entity that handles their CSI and other kind of organizational strategic engagement with their communities, that convenes groups of stakeholders in the pursuit of their various kind of mission-driven objectives that aren't around the property management portfolio explicitly. And we found engaging with them has been a very interesting process, a bit of both soul searching, but also learning and broadening our own perspective. And how does one engage with, from our perspective, kind of substantially aligned individuals within a corporate entity, but yet, obviously having a group like the Waterfront involved starts to change the dynamics of what these food dialogues might be perceived to be all about, or even what they may become in the future. So, for us, it's been a very practical kind of lived reality of wrestling with some of these things that are talked about. And yeah, I've benefited from hearing these different perspectives, and would just ask that, for those who, like I said, are attuned to the dialogues that we've been running, to please, feed back to us and be loving critics of the process, or perhaps not loving critics of the process, because that's how we get better at doing what we do. And if we need to change tack and do some things differently, we're certainly open to that. We've often used a phrase that is kind of been hinted at here, but I don't think it's been explicitly stated, which is, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We want to make a positive contribution through what we're doing. And if it turns out that we're doing more harm than good, then great. But in the meantime, we're not going to try and find the perfect solution, but just a better one going forward. So thanks for giving me the chance, Florian, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments as well.
Thanks, Kurt. And do drop in the link to the Food Dialogues website. I think there's some really excellent information and stories there, voices that haven't perhaps been heard widely. So thanks for your reflections also on how Food Dialogues as an organization is wrestling with some of these complexities. Gareth, your hand is up.
Thanks, Flo. And I think, Julian prompted some interesting questions that I've been grappling with around this question of what's there already. And I do, and Laurie and Chantal will be aware of this kind of the work, that the sort of context of this creation of slow violence that the food system, in my view, represents. But that problem has been design oriented. It's a particular system that's been designed for a particular purpose that rests way outside our current food system change. It rests with our economic system. It rests with our extractive industries that were sort of needed cheap labor, etc. And it rests with a structuring of society that goes so much further back that we do need to be able to think of how that gets redesigned. But my question always is, whose design and whose concepts of innovation? And in the spaces in which I've worked, and in the times in which I've engaged in these particular processes, and I recognize we need to redesign these processes. They need fundamental redesign, rupturing, whatever it might be. But the real challenge is, how do these conversations start to play out, that we can start to find these multiple pathways that emerge? Because I don't think, my experience is that there's never really one. And it's about how we start to see all those as having kind of value. And a colleague who was a student of Senate's that Andrew mentioned makes reference to having to crochet the way together, and our kind of learning and our ways of engaging are to try to keep things in these particular neat boxes, and this loosely held crocheting of multiple things together as an analogy becomes a potentially useful way to think about how we engage. What that means for bringing in the wolf in the sheep's clothing and things like that is another question. And I think the deep level of ethic where the focus of the intervention determines the ethic and becomes the site of everything. So in our work around data, when we're interviewing people, they're the owners of the data. Therefore, that data must be made as open as possible in order to support that community. But I do think how we engage in this question of innovation and design and the comments around the profile of the speakers, you know, whose voices are being heard, whose are not being heard, and how we bring those other voices into these spaces requires this deep level of reflexivity. The second point I want to make is that I think we face, and here I want to draw and make reference, and if anyone can get hold of it now, it's a recent book by an urbanist called Tom Slater, who speaks specifically around this notion of agnotology. And for me, this question of agnotology is the deliberate creation of ignorance. It's what the tobacco industry did in order to get doctors to promote cigarettes, and how much agnotology is evident and embedded in the food system, how much ignorance is being kind of presented as fact, as knowledge, in order to shift opinion, you know. And we all see it in, you know, the informal economy, you know, the informal traders. They're just trying to avoid taxation. They just don't want to pay formal business registration. Their food is unhealthy. It's, you know, you've got to really be careful of the food safety questions around that, and how these things, through academic reports, through others who all have these vested interests. And so how we engage in these processes, but where we also engage in what is truth, what is reality, and how that comes out. And I mean, the eternal question, but it is how we start to have these conversations when those realities differ, where there are very powerful people, as Chantal and Laurie have made mention, who are deliberately trying to influence the decision. Mothers don't know, so we need to be able to help them. You know, these ways in which opinion has been shifted. And that makes it particularly difficult to have these conversations. And I think for me, this idea of the dialogue and this ability to, I read Baum, and that was kind of who influenced my concept of dialogue. It is particularly important to be able to have these conversations where we can think about whose voices, whose concepts, who's not in the room, what are we taking to be truth, and how we are open to challenge in those spaces. Yeah, I don't, you know, and how do we become reflexive in that process in ourselves and think about, you know, what are our truths and how are those being shaped by others as well. But yeah, I think, let me leave it at that. It's more a rambling than a comment, but I think the question of kind of who's design and who's innovation, and how do we kind of caution against this concept of agnotology.
Thanks, Gareth. A really interesting new term for me, agnotology, the deliberate cultivation of ignorance through scientific means. It seems to be, yeah, quite a growing business nowadays. Definitely one which makes a lot of really dodgy things possible. Yeah, and I think your questions around, you know, who's designing, whose voices are heard, and who's not in the room, those are really important. And I think the reference to reflexivity is really essential. And, you know, that's very valuable for us as conveners of such spaces. And I also see a comment in the text chat. Stephen Haslani says, you know, for instance, in the case of child nutrition, is the voice of mothers and caregivers present in the dialogue? And that's a really valid and legitimate question. And who calls multi-stakeholder dialogues? And I think those are really, really valuable points. Chantal, facilitation and manipulation in one. Yes. I hope I haven't been facilitating too much in our conversations today. Yeah, so the other interesting remark that I see in the chat, Scott mentioned the not so safe conversations, the not so safe spaces. And I'm not sure, Scott, if you would like to speak to that, perhaps from your experience, Scott, if you're still in the call, because I think that's also important for us to have spaces which are edgy. which are conflictual. And that's a really tricky space to hold.
I mean, I don't want to speak too much about at all, but the not so safe spaces are where, for example, the power of white men can be identified. So who is controlling? And in the food lab, that has been some of our most powerful moments in terms of small groups coming together, coming up with ideas and innovations, and then coming forward. And who does it fall to? Who speaks for the group? And these things have been, in one or two instances, have been identified and challenged. And what it does, it subverts that power. So it's not a safe space, because it can be very challenging for those that are well-meaning, that are intending to facilitate change, that believe in dialogue, but they themselves maybe shouldn't be speaking. Maybe they should be standing aside. And so the not so safe spaces enable that. That is all really my point. And Ralph's paper sort of tries to address something of that too. Thanks, Flo.
Thanks, Scott. That is really such a valuable point, a beautiful mirror that you're holding up. Yes, and one that hopefully we'll be able to shift away from those particular forms of exclusion and power, which we as facilitators, as white men, often in the space hold. And I was also very aware of that in terms of the composition of our panel of speakers and respondents. So thanks for raising that and suspending that for such clear view. Any other comments and reflections on today's conversations? Okay, I don't see any raised hands, and perhaps Scott's comment is a really good place to leave the conversation today. I just, in closing, wanted to just remind everyone of the link which my colleague Camilla put into the text chat. We are interested in feedback around these events so that we can improve them, and would like to invite you to check out the link and give us your feedback through the form. It's a Google form that will enable us to learn from these events and design them more effectively with everyone's input. The other point that I just briefly wanted to conclude with is that we are planning one of our next multi-stakeholder processes, one of our next conversations, and that will be around agroecology, and that will be on the 10th of November. So please hold the date. We will send out invitations, and that's really about agroecology transitions and what that means at the local and provincial level in terms of governance. And it'll also be an opportunity for us to learn about some of the research which has recently been conducted, also by Scott and a colleague Stephen Greenberg and others, around the policy and governance environment concerning agroecology. So if agroecology is of interest to you, please check it out. It's really likely to be an interesting event, and hopefully we'll broaden our horizons a little more. So yeah, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of our speakers and panelists and everyone who's contributed to the chat and the conversation. We look forward to further conversations, and yeah, we invite any commentary from you that'll help us to refine our approach and to propose topics as well for further conversation, and to create spaces for really more inclusive dialogue, so that these conversations can reach more people and voices that are not heard can be heard more widely. So thank you all very much, and we look forward to seeing you again in future communities of practice. Have a beautiful day.
Thanks, Flo. That was fantastic.
Thank you all.